28 Years Later with Cillian Murphy is the only way to fix 28 Days Later's past sequel mistakes. Following the failure of 28 Days Later's past sequel, 28 Years Later sounds like a brilliant idea, especially if Cillian Murphy is involved in the project. Directed by Danny Boyle and written by Alex Garland, 28 Days Later uses its zombie apocalypse setting as a narrative device to tell a deeply moving story of human morality and survival. Danny Boyle's quasi-documentary direction style and Alex Garland's emphasis on realism in the story make 28 Days Later a genre standout that not only gives audiences a disturbing depiction of crumbling society, but also leaves them with a semblance of hope with its positive conclusion. The sequel, 28 Weeks Later, tried recreating the tension and horrors of the first movie, but it failed to leave a lasting impact on viewers and critics. Unlike 28 Days Later, which primarily received a favorable response from audiences, 28 Weeks Later was criticized for its heavy emphasis on action and less on character development. These elements made it seem less like a worthy sequel for 28 Days Later, and more like an addition to the slew of other run-of-mill zombie flicks. Fortunately, with some updates surrounding the development of another sequel, 28 Years Later, it seems like the 28 Days Later movie series will finally be able to revive itself. 28 Years Later's time jump means it can ignore 28 Weeks Later, and that's good. Although chronologically 28 months later should have been the next addition to the movie series, 28 Years Later makes more sense. In an interview, Alex Garland said via Inverse that he avoided making another sequel for the movie series because 28 Weeks Later bugged him to a point where he would rather write a different story in a different world. He also hinted that an idea for 28 Years Later had materialized in his head, and Danny Boyle even liked the idea. The fact that Alex Garland already has some good scripting ideas for 28 Years Later is great news for the movie series' future, since the movie's time jump allows the story to ignore the pitfalls of 28 Weeks Later. By skipping 28 months later, the movie series can completely avoid all the inconsistent story elements that ensued in 28 Weeks Later and focus on a fresh narrative. This fresh narrative could be more in tandem with the elements of 28 Days Later, which would generate new interest among the audiences of the first movie. Not to mention, since more than 2 decades have passed since the release of 28 Days Later, the sequel's timeline would be better aligned with real time if it unfolds 28 years after the first movie's events. Jumping ahead in time would also leave room for the movie series to introduce new characters while reinstating old ones like Cillian Murphy's Jim, Naomi Harris's Selena, and Megan Burns' Hannah, who audiences connected with after watching 28 Days Later. While 28 Days Later has an optimistic ending where Jim, Selena, and Hannah get rescued, it is slightly ambiguous in the sense that it leaves a viewer wondering what might have happened to the trio later. Since the world they live in is not the same anymore, it seems likely that they must have faced even bigger challenges after getting rescued. A sequel set years later after 28 Days Later could mark Cillian Murphy's return as Jim and highlight how living in the post-apocalyptic world has changed him over the years. Considering how it takes only a few days for Jim to go through a rite of passage in 28 Days Later's dark post-apocalyptic world, a time jump of 2 decades would allow for an even more mature and seasoned version of the character, who has seen and endured a lot in his pursuit of survival. Cillian Murphy, too, agrees that the movie series' timeline should jump ahead to 28 years later, and has even expressed his interest in returning by saying via Collider, "If Alex Garland thinks there's a script in it and Danny wants to do it, I'd love to do it." 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later only focused on the near-future aftermath of the rage virus pandemic. By unfolding several years after the outbreak, 28 Years Later can delve even deeper into new groups, factions, coups, and ideologies surrounding the infected that have emerged.